So as the panelists actually head down and we do a little change around, here's a little video from Case Western Reserve.
"16 Nobel laureates, captains of industry, inventors, innovators, and dreamers. At Case Western Reserve, we think beyond the possible every single day. From a 19th century experiment that informed Einstein's theory of relativity to 21st century technologies that transform education, we find ways to achieve what no one else believes can be done. Our former dean won a Nobel for work to defeat polio. An alumnus helped Rosa Parks take her seat on the bus, and another invented the world's first commercial bionic device. And we are just getting started. We teach students how to turn their ideas to reality, take them to market, and sometimes sell them. But the real proof of our value is shown in the accomplishments of our graduates, whether preparing to reshape healthcare or breaking barriers in major league sports. Because at Case Western Reserve, we will always think beyond the possible.
Sorry, we're just working on some technical issues up here. So one of the things with these radio frequency and Wi-Fi type of mics, they like to be on. So then our friends in the back can see them. When they shut them off, they got to reignite and get back in the system. So moving on. So as I just mentioned, one of our questions came in, kind of queuing us up for this next discussion, which, as we're calling, is Leo's Getting Crowded. So we're going to talk a little bit about space traffic and debris management. So I'd like to also just mention again that our sponsor for this panel is SAIC. With that, I'd like you to please welcome our moderator, Carissa Christensen. She's the founder and CEO of BryceTech, and she's a really good friend of AAS. I think anytime we ask her to come and queue up something, she always volunteers and says, yep, what should we talk about this time? So, Carissa, with that, I'll let you move on, introduce the rest of your panel, and we'll move forward.
Thank you very much. So we are going to have a very conversational panel today because we have such a good panel for such an interesting topic. So our topic is, we're going to talk about space traffic management and debris under the broader title of Who's Getting Crowded. I'm Carissa Christensen with BryceTech. BryceTech is an engineering analytics firm. We're a proud NASA contractor. We also produce studies and reports on trends in the industry, including one on small sats and a number on trends in the satellite industry generally. And one incredibly noticeable trend is that 6 or 7 years ago, we were looking at an on-orbit population of satellites of around 1,000. We're now at 5,000. We've gone from launching dozens of satellites a year to thousands of satellites a year, with the potential for that number to grow year over year. That really is an extraordinary transformation. And it has consequences. It has consequences in terms of potentially profound capability, and also consequences in terms of the crowding, the challenges to the use of very valuable orbits. And so today, to talk about this topic, we have Patricia Cooper, I'm going to start with Patricia. Patricia was the president of the Satellite Industry Association, representing the broad satellite industry, as well as senior vice president at SpaceX for government relations, working issues of space traffic management and debris. So Patricia brings, and now is consulting to and she's in high demand, to a wide variety of clients. Patricia really brings the perspective of the satellite operator and how the satellite operator fits into this discussion. And then we have Dianne Poster, who was a NIST, with NIST. She is a liaison now working with the Office of Space Commerce in the Department of Commerce. The Office of Space Commerce, of course, is our civil focal point for these issues. And Dianne is part of the team that is now working to manage this challenge and balance the interests of industry, the capabilities that these satellite systems can deliver, with the mitigation of debris issues and coordination of space traffic management. And then finally, we have Doug Chunn. Doug is with Slingshot Aerospace, and Slingshot is one of the new data analytics and space domain awareness type companies that is seeking to provide expertise, insight, information, and coordination to help address these challenges through commercial capabilities. So that's our panel. I think you'll agree that it's a really well put together panel for this topic. I can say that because the organizer, and I want to thank the organizers for doing such a good job of coordinating this panel. And let's start out with, let's talk about this problem, this issue. So the reality is, we, NASA, the space community, have been operating with debris for decades. Debris is not a new problem. There are tools and techniques to operate in an environment that struggles with debris. So what's different? Is this really going to be the kind of problem that we see in the media that people have said? And if so, why? What's different about this? And Patricia, maybe we start with you, and then Dianne, and then Doug.
Good morning, everyone. This is a fascinating topic, and I will challenge you to think about it not as a monolithic problem, but one that has many different facets, different objectives, and largely different solutions. So is there a growing problem at LEO? Yes, there are more satellites going up. That means more instances of potential conjunction. Is it time to update the construct that we've had to deal with it for the scenario that Carissa had described just earlier, which would be, NASA and a handful of commercial companies operating, a couple other space agencies operating at LEO, small numbers of satellites at very diverse altitudes and orbits. That era is gone because of the proliferation of networks of very large numbers of satellites that share the same altitudes and orbital characteristics. So that creates, I think, a very different environment, not just the volume of satellites, but also the sort of the concentration at identifiable locations in space. The other trend that we kind of forgot was a warning signal for this, was not just the constellations that are currently being built in very large numbers for broadband to connect internet services from space to Earth, but the sort of wave of satellites that came just before it on the commercial side, which are medium-sized now constellations of satellites for Earth observing. So the Planet, the Spire, this all comes out of a fundamental shift in the way that space can be undertaken. Easier to build small satellites. Look at how many companies now build their own satellites, as opposed to going to outside third-party manufacturers. And then you have the access to space not only from a more regular US-based launch company like SpaceX, but also a proliferation of smaller vehicles that can deliver smaller handfuls of satellites, not a whole constellation. And add to that this wave of capital that is inspired by space and hopes to catch that same unicorn of success. I think that has created this current era that we're in. The next era, I think, is going to be one of higher expectations to be in space. And I think that means on the spacecraft design and its capability. I think it means a responsibility to be able to protect your own infrastructure with maneuverability potentially above certain altitudes. I think it's going to mean more disclosures and transparencies about where you are and what your capabilities are for negotiations and conjunctions. And I think it's going to require more of an international collaboration. And I think right now, the open questions are not whether industry's interested in that. In fact, industry's been calling for this kind of change. The question is, what are the right moves to achieve those diverse objectives? Improved quality of the spacecraft so that they are able to respond when they see a risk. Improved understanding of the environment around them with better data and better tools. Some understanding of rules of the road, which may not be handed down from, they may be handed down or they may be voluntarily negotiated. And a sense of how long your spacecraft can remain in space after the mission is done. So these are all very different facets, but lots of levers that I think are still open to utilize to improve the environment for a more lively, a more active, a more populated LEO.
Thank you, Patricia. Dianne, how does the Department of Commerce and the broader government think about this problem and how serious this problem is?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Carissa. And really, on behalf of Richard Dalbello, our new director for the Office of Space Commerce, thank you all for attending today and the opportunity from our sponsors to be here. And the Office of Space Commerce and the Department of Commerce is really looking at these issues as was just described by Patricia, especially in the international context of sharing and cooperation, and one of the key areas to that is standards and standards development and interoperability, especially interoperability in data mechanisms, data sharing, and of course from a technical standpoint, from interfaces and connections, as we heard about really nicely yesterday in the different programs for Gateway and the Artemis, but also interoperability in a sense of orbital debris management. And this was recently just a great testament to this was the announcement from the U.S. Space Force SpaceWorks program, which is the technical arm of the U.S. Space Force. There was a great article in Space News in May on this, where 125 contracts were awarded for on-orbit servicing, manufacturing, and assembly, but which includes a large component of orbital debris management and removal. And originally, the program anticipated that maybe only 25 or 30 contracts would be awarded, through its campaigning and trying to engage interest from industry. But there was such a large input of interest from the industry that 125 contracts were awarded. And in the next 2 years, the program is hoping to have a demonstration project for specific orbital debris removal and management. And I think that gives a sense of urgency to the problem at hand and the issue at hand, and that orbital debris risk management is really essential.
Thank you, Dianne. So Doug, Slingshot clearly thinks there's something going on here. It's kind of an existence proof for the company. Can you talk a little bit about how challenging this problem is and what the indicators of that are?
Yeah, thank you. It's definitely busy. It's definitely getting busier. You saw one of the slides earlier about the Starlink SpaceX satellites flying in lower Earth orbit, and they fly relatively low, about 550 kilometers. And so you do have to navigate through that as you go into LEO. China, we talked about that earlier, is also talking about launching thousands of satellites, and they'll be right below at about 500 and right above. And then you've got Amazon, who's very soon going to launch thousands as well, right above them as well. So not only is it busy now, right, Now you're going to soon have to navigate through 4 of these bands of satellites to get into LEO. And to put that in perspective from a data standpoint, there used to be, call it 3 or 4 million CDMs coming from the 18th a year. There's over 700,000 CDMs coming out a day.
Can you just unpack that for the CDM team, just to make sure that we've got everybody on the
So apologize. So as a satellite operator, you most likely rely on the 18th of the Space Force, and they will send out via email a conjunction data message or a CAN, close approach notice, letting you know that there's a potential conjunction with you and another piece of debris or active payload. And so when there was only, as you mentioned, a couple hundred satellites up there, and you were only getting a couple hundred maybe a month, as I mentioned, there's now over 700,000 coming out a day. So some of these larger constellations are getting thousands and thousands of them a day, that then they have to determine which ones are important and which ones they have to act on. Now that's happening on both sides if it's an active payload. So the volume of data coming at 2 particular conjuncting operators is growing so exponentially that they're now looking more and more for technological solutions to help them with things like maneuver recommendations. So it's definitely busy. They're already kind of feeling that traffic now, and it's going to grow exponentially as well.
And email is not the ideal solution to that?
Pencils and spreadsheets and emails was working not too long ago, but it's not working today.
Okay, so we've got pretty good evidence that there is that the environment is getting more crowded and that there are challenges coming on. And I want to mention another aspect of that challenge, which is the business outcomes associated with some of these very large systems. Those business outcomes aren't guaranteed. There's a lot of optimism. There's a lot of money chasing space-based services to provide broadband to end users. The business risk also to create some additional risk with regard to the orbital environment and the ability of companies to engage appropriately in that environment in later stages of their evolution and growth. So let's talk about why this problem matters. What are the what markets, what activities could this increased orbital activity inhibit or affect? And Dianne, do you want to maybe kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. From a commerce perspective, we see a lot of needs for really engaging, as I mentioned, in the standards development, but for new developing markets and areas where technologies for precision measurements from space are going to be really critical, and in medicine applications, healthcare, epidemiology, mining applications, farming, things like that, I think will be really essential from a commerce perspective.
So markets that are sort of that are platform related, certainly you think would be affected, and maybe even beyond that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Doug, what's your take on emerging markets that might be affected, or existing markets?
It's an interesting question, and one that I kind of struggle to answer because, in a way, it affects almost everything and everyone. I mean, we rely on space technology in our day-to-day lives. Everyone relies on that in planning future missions. We've been talking today how we're trying to not just get into LEO for all the advantages in LEO, but get to cislunar and even eventually make it to Mars. So uncertainty in LEO kind of is that first step getting out as debris and the number of active payloads out there increases. Really can cause concern for everybody.
Patricia, this is definitely an issue that you've had some engagement on.
When we talked about satellites and why they were useful, maybe a decade ago, we talked about delivery of television content, which is a big deal. Providing cable television-like services for people that are far away from cable networks, which is the biggest contributor to the space economy, by the way, by far. We talked about things like gas station point-of-sale credit card transactions and emergency services. And those are all things that satellites do well. But the new kinds of architectures with satellites that are closer to the Earth and in larger numbers allows for different kinds of services. The 4 largest constellations that are underway right now that are either have had demonstration satellites or are deploying SpaceX's Starlink satellite system, which has about 2,500 satellites in orbit, OneWeb's 600 satellite system, which is in the 400s right now, Telesat, which is a Canadian system that plans to do a couple hundred satellites, and Amazon has a Kuiper program that would be several thousand satellites at 600 kilometers. All of those are focused on taking advantage of their proximity to the Earth's surface and the short latency of a signal that contrasts sharply with the geostationary satellite platforms of the past. If you and you could easily say that latency didn't matter. A 500 millisecond delay from a geostationary satellite didn't really matter until we did 2 years of video conferencing at home. And you can't fight that fight anymore. Latency is useful and important for many interactive services, and I think we've jumped over, whether we wanted to or not, a whole number of hurdles about interactive services. So latency is important for broadband, it's important for video conferencing, it's important for a lot of data exchange sensitive kinds of activities, and that's one of the application shifts that these low Earth orbiting satellite systems permit. I mentioned earlier too the Earth observing services, remote sensing, and SARS, all kinds of other services that are better achieved with these low Earth orbiting systems. So I kind of wanted to flip it and say what services are available now or are going to be available because we've created this activity in low Earth orbit. And I would just note too, another kind of reference to the pandemic. I can't tell you how many governments I have spoken with who, 5 years ago would say, I'm doing pretty well. I've got like 75% of my population has access to the internet. And in the US, it's in the 90s. It's like maybe less than 10% of Americans are without access to the internet. And that's pretty good. But now, after the pandemic, when you rely on it to work from home, when you rely on it to study, to have a medical appointment, to function in your daily life, almost everything is online now, government services. Those percentages at 75% aren't good enough anymore. And so governments around the world have broadband plans that are designed to reach almost everyone. And from a technology perspective, it is ridiculously expensive to expect that those last 10% of people to be connected with terrestrial means. Satellite is the way that you're going to get to that very large policy objective. And I would just also note the dual policy objective that comes in part from the Commerce Department and the White House, which is we want space to be dynamic and innovative and a driver for our economy. So those are just somewhat maybe on the opposite side of what is enabled, what is driving, what is promoting the investment and exploration in those systems.
It's so interesting because, go ahead, Dianne.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you, Patricia. And just to add to that, from a commerce perspective and from NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, space cybersecurity for these applications is becoming increasingly important and a focus. NIST has produced several publications just in the last year of the application of its cybersecurity framework to space systems, including ground systems. And we're also partnering with the Department of Homeland Security for a symposia series on this topic, and we've had 3 of those to date. And the importance of that, we've had over 1,900 people register for those events virtually to attend and listen in on these applications.
Thank you.
If I could just add one other thing. I was just thinking that there is obviously something appealing in this constellation format because it has become the source of some envy and some copycatting. Like the European goal now is to create a constellation. Although they had plenty of proposals early on, some of them didn't make it. They have a ministerial level goal to create a constellation. The Chinese government have said that they were explicit, they wanted an answer to Starlink, and they have now regulatory filings for a system of 13,000 satellites. So not all of the systems will succeed, and we can talk about why they might not or why they might, but there's a positive impetus behind it. It's not just up there to get in your way.
And on that, interest, governmental interest. I think the UK government's investment in OneWeb is another indicator of that phenomenon. I think it's so interesting, Patricia, you talking about the dynamic of serving underserved populations. So Patricia pointed out that direct-to-home television, so satellite dish on your home, contributes a huge amount to the space economy, and that makes sense because it's a value-added service, right? You're paying not just for access to the satellite, your subscription covers programming and so on, and that integrated value is revenue is coming into the space company. Direct-to-home television started by seeking to provide services to the something like 30% of Americans who did not have access to cable TV. The majority, I mean, more than 90% of Americans now have access to cable TV, but direct-to-home television has become an effective competitor to cable based on programming, based on costs, based on customer service. And so that's a very interesting dynamic to look at with regard to the big LEO constellations that are seeking to provide broadband. So, as we look forward, before we talk about what we can do about this, which is probably the most important question, what are some of the? And then I do want to make sure that we've got time for some good conversation with the audience. Are there any warning signs or indicators or metrics that commerce is tracking, that companies track, that Slingshot is tracking, that you would say, oh, this is I won't use the term tipping point, but this is a point, this is an indicator of that action is needed or that things have gotten meaningfully worse. Looking forward, what are you thinking about or tracking? And maybe Dianne, you start us on that one too.
Yeah, absolutely. From a commerce perspective, as I've mentioned, the standards development are really something that we've been tracking, and the number of engagements for things in like orbital debris risk management planning and having an integrated plan for orbital debris management in a standards format through international standards developing organizations such as ISO, that is very much increasing, and that's again a signal to the importance of these issues, not only domestically but internationally.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're looking at is just the increase in the operator's need to maneuver, to get out of the way. So as mentioned before, as more and more data is coming in about a potential conjunction, there's more and more a need potentially to maneuver. And the reason why I think that gets really difficult, if you think about it from a very specific, if these two are going to potentially conjunct, and they are both getting data, but they're running their own analysis, and they're unable to actually connect, coordinate, collaborate on that, it only makes the problem that much worse. I mean, if you looked at specifically SpaceX's filings recently, I mean, they had to do almost 7,000 maneuvers in just the first half of the year, and that's at several thousand satellites, looking to grow to 30, 40,000.
We're sort of like the dog that caught the fire truck. You know, this is exactly what we said we wanted 15 years ago. Innovation, investment, you know, new applications, a growing space economy. But now we have to think about what we got. And I think it is going to be an ongoing balance for policymakers and companies alike to encourage pulling together and collaborating while still allowing innovation and updates. You don't want to chill this very exciting period of discovery and invention. But I do think, I see some kind of promising signs that where we've moved on from the earliest, maybe most aggressive competitive days of these various projects talking to each other. I see large competitors agreeing on how to share spectrum. I see large competitors striking a voluntary deal about how to physically maneuver with each other. I think the question of rules of the road is something that I know is being discussed by large carriers about a voluntary approach. If we're head-to-head, who goes where? And those are all voluntary steps that mirror what happened in GEO through direct collaboration of large operators and the establishment of an organization called the Space Data Association. So I think those are all promising. I also really am intrigued by some incentive-based approaches to reward companies that have made smart moves for investing in their spacecraft, whether it's propulsion or the materials that they select for deorbit and human risk after reentry, or if it's for automated collision avoidance systems or other steps. The World Economic Forum is developing a space sustainability rating, sort of like a LEEDs rating for a building or a good housekeeping seal of approval. And if you meet those goals, you aren't penalized if you don't, but you may get maybe an insurance advantage or an investment advantage if you meet those goals. I like that incentive-based side. And the UK government has just set up a space sustainability rating as well, kind of a kite mark that they're planning to develop. So I think those are all positives. On the voluntary measures side, I also have a little bit of caution about the draconian measures by governments, because we are seeing sort of exactly what we thought we wanted a decade ago.
So we sort of moved into talking about what you can do about this, and Patricia has talked about a voluntary action by companies to maintain the environment in which they operate. They can't operate without a functional orbital environment. Patricia, you talked about designing satellites differently to reduce the likelihood of failure and contribution to debris. Dianne, you've talked about standards and having systematic planning for debris management, debris mitigation with some degree of international coordination. So 2 questions. Are there other mechanisms? And 2, how does this work? I mean, you think about the ITU and GEO is managing a much more structured environment, orbital slots, and it has no authority, no enforcement authority, right? The ITU exists and operates and functions because of the participation of national agencies. So how does that translate to LEO?
So I'd first say the International Telecommunications Union has no authority over debris management. It is a spectrum-focused organization. Like the FCC, there's no statutory authority at the FCC to do anything about physical coordination. The FCC have been making some policy decisions just because they're authorizing so many satellites. But part of the challenge is there isn't a super handy organization outside of the UN organizations, the UN Office of Outer Space Activities, or the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, to do this on an international basis, on a truly international governmental basis. I do think the leading countries with the largest number of proposals have an opportunity to lead by example. And that certainly includes the US, it includes the UK, it includes Canada, France. Germany has a surprising number of ITU proposals filed through it, Rwanda and China.
So, Dianne, how does commerce and how do you think about this organizational construct that we would need?
Yeah, and from commerce, working through our interagency, we're coordinating very closely with our FAA colleagues and our FCC colleagues. And if you recall, in the fall of 2020, both those agencies did release on the web guidelines and rulemaking activities related to orbital debris management, including with the FAA for space flight safety planning to include orbital debris as part of that in the management plan for those activities, which was very instrumental. And I think that's going to be continuing in the future, especially as the standard developing organizations are engaging more in this area particularly.
So Doug, where does Slingshot fall in this solution space thinking?
Well, no surprise here with my background. I'm really kind of focused on how we technologically enable these organizations. So once we have the standards, once we have the rules of the road, once we have kind of a path on how to be a sustainable space citizen, how do we continue to evolve in terms of the technology to allow them to do that? As we've seen here, there's been great advancements in the hardware to get them up there. I think one of the things that will be important is to see the software to continue to evolve in a way that empowers them to meet all those standards.
So expand a little bit on what the software challenges are beyond, maybe let's move from something a little more automated than the current system. Is the vision that satellites will autonomously respond to potential conjunctions and this will all happen automatically? Is the vision, talk a little bit about what that looks like.
Well, the autonomy actually leads to the importance of coordination as well. So there's many different needs. Let me give you a little background on kind of where I'm coming with some of this context. So we have had many of the top 20 largest operators help us and build the platform that we're working on today. So as part of my job, I get to talk to satellite operators almost every day and kind of learn about the challenges that are out there. And while they all have different needs, you know, the one thing that continues to come up is unique and valuable data they don't have access today, right? Get it faster so that they can maneuver and use it in the right amount of time, and then the ability to coordinate on that information as well. So as of right now, there are, I guess, one that can autonomously maneuver based on the data that's ingested into the spacecraft. And then there needs to be a coordination with the other side, if it's an active payload, to make sure that they know that that one is autonomous and can take responsibility for the maneuver. But the part that we're thinking about now is as that technology continues to increase, what happens when both sides are autonomous? How do we make sure that they're able to be connected in a way where there's not a conjunction?
Thank you. So so we've talked about process and policy approaches. Patricia talked a little bit about satellite design. What are some, and from a technology standpoint, you talked about sort of software and analytics technology. Are there other technology solutions that are relevant here? Active debris removal, or I recall, I mean, there are so many interesting techniques for debris removal. I recall years ago, there's one that I was particularly I just thought was so interesting, which was a concept of essentially shooting out a pool of goo to collect up tiny debris. And I thought, I think a lot of people thought maybe that's not where we want to go in the debris environment. So let's talk about some maybe more practical solutions that are on the table now. And Dianne, do you want to start that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from a measurement perspective, understanding prediction and capabilities from mathematical modeling, I think is really essential, and forwarding that through a standardized approach will be really essential in this area. But also the artificial intelligence and those types of applications, I think we'll see interfacing with the technology developments from a hardware point of view.
So knowing what's going on orbit and enabling satellites to predict and react to some extent would be your top. Okay, Patricia?
Yeah, I think I want to underscore the importance of propulsion. It's great to know what's coming at you. It isn't great to know you can't move out of the way. So I think that is an important question that's going to come up, whether it's going to be an incentive for private companies to invest in, to protect their own infrastructure, whether it's something that's encouraged in some other way. I think that's going to happen.
So I'll put Dianne on the spot. Are we going to get to the point where you're just not allowed to launch a satellite without propulsion? Or would you like to see that? We won't tell Richard.
Yeah. I think that's definitely an interagency discussion and very important, but I don't think we have an answer for that right now.
And I also think there's some good development work to be done on less costly types of propulsion, and that maybe address some of the swap issues that smaller satellites have with it, or you change maybe some of the altitudes they can go to. I also seen some good work on the materials selected for spacecraft, so that upon re-entry, there's less risk to human life or property on the ground. I think that's a success. And I also think there's a lot of discussion right now. The international rule is that you deorbit within 25 years. That's the IADC rule. There's a great deal of agreement that that could be tightened for lower altitudes, that in some ways it allows you to sort of hang up there when at the end of your mission life much longer than you would otherwise need to. I think that'll be a policy change that we will see. I think it's going to be a topic of discussion for the next period.
So you launch a constellation, and you've got a plan for deorbit, and that works presumably for the vast majority of your satellites. There's some, satellites that may not be able to deorbit as planned, and there are commercial providers that are seeking to provide essentially backup deorbit. Typically, that would require a pre-planning and preparation of the satellite, and then there's the none of that works, and you create a debris field, and that I think starts to be interesting because it gets into the economics of pollution. Mm-hmm. It's very hard. One of the problems in cleaning up pollution of any type is attribution and economic responsibility. So who is responsible for doing that? And I think that's a very interesting conversation about government policy and government roles. And I know Doug probably wants to jump in, and please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think the push to lower altitudes is also partly informed by that quick deorbit at the end of life. So if you had a failure, it wouldn't be a 25-year deorbit, a problem in that way. But it is, I just wanted to say, I do think it's one of the most delightful things about our space industry is that the active debris removal proposals all sound crazy, and it's so much fun because many of them are going to work. I think it's one of the great things about our sector is that the solutions are really creative and in some cases fanciful, and some of them will work.
And it's going to be very interesting, the next panel that talks about in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. Of course, there's so much technology overlap for particularly on-orbit servicing. Doug, do you want to comment?
I was just going to say, I think you were onto something earlier. I mean, if anyone has small children like I do, they love slime. So maybe we start introducing slime for debris removal into STEM programs. That could be a potential solution as well.
And this is when the Glenn Symposium jumped the shark, right here. Mark your calendars. We did it. So I'm going to ask, let's turn to audience questions, if we've got any immediately ready to go. Oh, terrific.
Hi, I'm Dianne Goodnow. I'm the tech lead for the Human Research Program Impact Project, which we go live in March. What it's used for is mission planning, how often the astronauts get injured and by what. So the ISS has had to move a lot more recently than they ever did for micrometeorites. So if I'm doing a Mars mission for the Human Research Program, do I just gotta take my rate of expected micrometeorites hits through the roof because in 10 years it's just gonna be bad? So for like orbit, where should I be looking for those future numbers? Like I can get the numbers now, but I can do like, oh, we fixed it all, and oh, it just went out of control.
So Dianne, do you want to talk a little bit about that kind of modeling and forecasting?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to comment that, for example, in ISO just released a technical report in December of last year, 2021, on a review of predictability of maneuvering and these types of operations, which you're very interested in. And that will be a living document, so that will be continuously updated. So as the challenges change and the landscape changes, that's a great resource to take a look at for those types of things as you move into the future.
Yeah, because a lot of what we do is forecasting, because we will be able to do on-orbit ops in version 2.0, but that's more for if someone gets something unexpected on station or on mission. But a lot of ours is, here's the future, what do I want in my med kit, what do I need to react?
I would also comment on that in doing that forecasting, realistic business modeling with regard to these constellations is going to be critical. A likelihood of success, mass growth of satellites. I mean, we're all so accustomed to saying satellites are getting smaller. In fact, what happens is a constellation is designed with very small satellites, and then every iteration of that constellation, the satellites get bigger. The physics and the economics of satellites, they want to be bigger. And so I think that's a very important part of that as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I just have a question on technology allowing for more tolerance of closing distances. You talked about automation of knowing what's coming, kind of like ADS-B or something like that. But will the technology allow for closer passes, more tolerance for that?
So you're not necessarily getting a warning notice when you're 5 kilometers away. So that's a very interesting question. Can you talk a little bit about the current state of play, and then we'll talk about where it's going?
Yeah, it's something that we've been talking to them quite a bit about. You have, like I said, a whole bunch of different data coming at them at once. But if you can find ways in which you take not only the observational data that's actually getting greater and greater in terms of what it's able to capture, but you're able to put that together with the data coming directly from the satellite, so the ephemeris, and then even what they would call the specials, which is where you could potentially grow. If you could aggregate that in a way we hear about digital space twin all the time, then you can become far more predictive. And it's not just taking a particular series of pictures, if you will, for lack of a technical term, and coming up with a decision. You're seeing where they could potentially grow as well.
So describe the most conservative model right now, where you're not getting you're not incorporating data from the satellite, for example. So what's leading to that very high number of warnings?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a couple things, but we mentioned prop up here quite a bit. I mean, there's some that do not have any propulsion for collision avoidance, and there's some that have such sophisticated systems that they can make a decision within 3 hours based on a particular missed distance. And so if you think about everything in between, the active payloads that are up there have different requirements in terms of the TCA, the time towards the potential collision. And so I think that's causing some confusion as well, is because, well, it could be debris in which you have to make the decision if you can, or it can be between 2 active payloads that have different criteria for when they actually have to make a decision. So it's not just the data coming in, but it's the requirements from both of the satellites in terms of when they actually have to move.
So Dianne, how is Commerce thinking about knowing what's going on, how to respond to it, and how does technology play into that vision of the future?
Yeah, as many of you know, Commerce is working very closely to take on its new role for space traffic coordination, and has been looking at building an open architecture data repository system that will help with sharing information and sharing best practices in these types of areas. So looking ahead, that tool will be very, very, very essential in this area.
I also wanted to just add, I think this tool, these kinds of insights that are now going to be available will also allow 2 operators in conjunction to be able to fly in closer formation. I think, but it requires not only a strong amount of actionable data, and I think a sort of government availability of that, as well as a sort of functional tool, and a trust and collaboration between those operators. And it really comes out of the value of many of you being at the same altitude. There's something special about that altitude, just like there was at GEO.
Do we have another audience question? So I think that then, excellent.
I have one for myself, actually. I like to term this black sky and internationals. There's a black sky up there that we have very little visibility into in the national security world, both for us and for other governments. How does that affect what's going on with the numbers, with the analysis, with the tools, and with the evasions. So that's part one, probably for Doug, and the other one's for Dianne, is how successful do we believe that we're going to be in getting folks like Russia and China and India to agree to solutions that they will effect, looking at how well they support the climate accords.
So I'm gonna make a comment on the black sky note. I think it's a really interesting topic. So we've got a catalog of what's in space that has some elements that are not shared for security reasons. We also have increasingly an increasingly robust, currently ground-based, some and with plans for more space-based observation network. So the ability to know what is in on orbit is getting better and better and better, and that is certainly creating pressure on our policies and approaches to classifying information. Dianne, do you want to talk about that a little bit to the extent you can?
Yeah, absolutely. I think more from the open side with the United Nations. The United Nations, and this is a follow-on to the second part of the question, that with engaging with all spacefaring nations, and the Commerce Department and its interagency partners are very closely engaged with the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs and through the Conference on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, and we're engaged in these types of dialogues to help maintain peaceful and operating environment.
I also think it's worth noting the point that was raised earlier. I think Patricia raised it. The increasing number of countries that have space programs that are thinking that are relying on space capabilities, there is strong international pressure to maintain an operable low Earth orbit. And in my more optimistic moments, I look at the global air traffic system, where countries that are not friendly manage to coordinate on commercial air traffic. Any other questions? I think if not, I'll ask sort of the wrap-up question, which is for each of our panelists. So looking forward, how successful are we going to be in managing this challenge, and what are milestones we should be paying attention to as we move ahead? And so, Doug, maybe you kick us off.
Okay. As I mentioned before, we're working really closely with many of the top operators, and I just wanted to say, kind of at a high level, I'm incredibly encouraged by how creative everyone is getting, how much they do want to work together, ways in which they want to even share best practices. It's not just asking us, can you help us in this area, but actually asking us what others are doing to solve that problem. So just the collaborative nature of this satellite operator community is really encouraging to me. And I definitely think it's something we can solve.
So, Patricia, you spent years herding those cats as the president of the Satellite Industry Association. What's your view?
Well, they don't agree on everything. But what I would say is I absolutely agree. The technology is coming to a place where we should feel quite comfortable that there's a technical capability to address much of this. And I am, as I said before, encouraged by the tenor of competitor collaboration and the direction that that's starting to go in a way that I wasn't 2 years ago. I haven't seen that confidence translating into kind of small groups of governments pushing forward to kind of shine the way ahead, and I think that's the next step. I am certainly impressed by how much attention and expertise and seriousness governments that are responsible for these constellations are putting into this issue. But the next stage is for that sort of to walk together in the same way. We need to move away from the time where governments say, I don't want to regulate that because I don't want to hamstring my industry.
And thinking internationally, this is for both you and Dianne, are there agencies within those nations whose job it is to worry about this? Is there a belly button where it needs to be globally? How's that going?
In some, and in others not. I think there's a strong commitment to being good stewards in space. I think that's a philosophical check in the right column. But the techniques and tools to do it, there's no real training for new space agencies. There's no real, roadmap to governing between two competing technologies. And I think that's where expert agencies can really build that community of thought leaders and policymakers.
So Dan, can you wrap us up with how optimistic are you about the future?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think summarizing with respect to all the engagement and the best practice sharing and how that's transcending into standards development processes through standard developing organizations and voluntary standards through consensus building with engagement from the commercial sector as well as the government side, and how that's been increasing over the past couple of years, specifically as the technologies become more complex and the systems become much larger. I think that's really encouraging to see that participation growing and the enthusiasm about that.
Well, with that, I will thank our panelists for a robust discussion today. Thank you for your attention and involvement, and thank the session sponsor, SAIC, and the organizers for the opportunity to discuss this important topic. Have a wonderful day.
Carissa, thank you very much. That was great. We really appreciate it.